Wake up, boy. I said wake up. Officer Reed Holloway's knuckle cracked against the driver's window hard enough to leave a ring mark on the glass. His short-sleeved uniform dark, with sweat patches under the noon sun flooding the parking lot. Command Sergeant Major Dorian Nash surfaced from the first real sleep he'd had in 61 hours, blinking against the overhead blaze of midday light, and reached slowly for his military ID. "Don't reach for anything." Holloway's gun cleared the holster before the words finished leaving his mouth. His partner, Craig Dunmore, already had the passenger door wrenched open. "You got 2 seconds to explain why you're not in a shelter where you belong." Dorian's hands went up, voice level, combat steady. "I am a United States Army Command Sergeant Major. I have federal identification in my left breast pocket, and I am asking you to please slow down." Holloway answered by snatching Dorian's phone off the center console and dropping it face down onto the asphalt, then pressing his boot heel through the screen with a sound like a cracking bone. Bystanders stopped walking. A teenager across the lot raised her phone, and somewhere inside the Pentagon, a general's assistant was already composing a Priority 1 welfare check for a classified special operations asset who had gone dark 14 minutes ago. Welcome to Frost Folktales. This is where we tell the stories of those who were underestimated, dismissed, and targeted, yet chose courage over silence. If these stories move you, subscribe and be part of a community that refuses to let them fade into the background. Rewind 18 minutes. Rewind further than that. Rewind 61 days to a classified location in a country whose name will not appear in this story, where Command Sergeant Major Dorian Nash led a 7-man special operations element through a mission briefed as 72 hours and stretched into 9 weeks because that is what classified missions do. They expand like water, finding every crack in a wall. The details of what Dorian Nash did on that deployment are sealed behind classifications that most people in this story do not have the clearance to read. What is not sealed is the cost. 3 men came back with permanent hearing damage from a detonation that Dorian Nash pulled 2 of them away from before the pressure wave arrived. 1 man came back missing a leg below the knee, and the last thing he said to Dorian Nash before the medical transport lifted was, "You kept your head, Sergeant Major." And Dorian Nash had nodded and said, "That's the job," and believed it, and carried the weight of that belief across 9 time zones back to American soil. He landed at Fort Caldwell's airfield at 6:48 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, completing his re-entry protocols, turning in equipment, sitting through a 40-minute medical screening with a young Army physician who asked him on a scale of 1 to 10 how he was sleeping, and Dorian Nash said 6 because 6 was honest enough to pass, and not so honest that it opened a door he didn't have the energy to walk through yet. He signed the last of his paperwork at 10:30 a.m. and walked to his silver Honda Pilot in the long-term lot and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. His apartment was 40 minutes away. 40 minutes on the interstate, which he had done 100 times, which was nothing, which was less distance than some of the night movements he had run on foot, carrying a full combat load. He pulled out of Fort Caldwell's main gate at 10:41 a.m. and drove 17 minutes before his eyes began closing in the particular slow way that is not tiredness, but the body's absolute refusal to continue. Not a request, a shutdown. He took the next exit, found the Food Max on Meridian Avenue, and pulled into the far corner of the parking lot where the midday sun came straight down through the windshield, and the AC hummed steadily, and the parking lot sounds of grocery carts and car doors were, in their ordinary way, the most peaceful sounds he had heard in 61 days. Before he closed his eyes, habit and protocol and something older than either one made him press his left hand against his chest, feeling the stiff fold of documents in his breast pocket: military ID, common access card, his DD-214. He had carried identification in that pocket since his first deployment, because identification is armor when you are a black man in a uniform that some people can see and some people looking at the man inside it, choose not to. He had learned that early, and the learning had never stopped being necessary. He pressed his hand against that pocket, felt the cards through the gray Henley, pulled his dark navy cargo pants straight at the knee out of long habit, and closed his eyes. He was asleep in 4 minutes. Deeply, completely, and entirely harmlessly asleep in a legally parked car in a public parking lot at 12:14 p.m. on a Tuesday. This is the fact that everything else in this story will return to. A man asleep in a car. A man who had spent 61 days making the world safer for people who would never know his name. Exhausted past the threshold of safe driving, doing the responsible thing, doing exactly what a careful person does, and sleeping. Reed Holloway and Craig Dunmore were in the FoodMax parking lot because of a noise complaint 3 rows over, a truck with a malfunctioning car alarm that had been cycling for 20 minutes and generated 4 separate calls to non-emergency dispatch. They found the truck, confirmed the owner had already been notified, and were preparing to clear the call when Reed Holloway spotted the silver Honda Pilot idling in the far corner with its windows up and a figure inside that he decided, from a distance of 40 feet, was suspicious. There is a specific kind of decision that gets made in that moment. A car idling in a parking lot during midday business hours is not unusual. People eat lunch in their cars. People make phone calls. People, as it turns out, sleep. Craig Dunmore would later say, in a background conversation that would make its way into print, that he didn't think it was anything, but he followed his partner because following his partner was what he did, and silence was the shape his compliance took. Reed Holloway walked to the driver's window and knocked. Not a courtesy knock, the kind of knock that is already an accusation, all knuckle and authority, cracking against the glass with the sharp report of someone who has already decided what they think before the window comes down. Dorian Nash surfaced from the deepest sleep he had managed in over 2 months. His eyes opened onto brightness, flat noon light, overhead and relentless, flooding the parking lot and the inside of his car simultaneously. He processed the situation in the trained way. Uniformed officer, weapon holstered but right hand resting on the grip, aggressive posture. Second officer moving around the front of the vehicle toward the passenger side. He did not panic. He did not make sudden movements. He placed both hands flat and visible on his thighs, and he looked at Reed Holloway, and he took a breath. His hand moved toward his left breast pocket. Don't reach for anything. The gun cleared the holster with a mechanical click that was loud in the closed space between the window glass and the officer's body, and Reed Holloway's face was hard and entirely certain, and the gun was pointed at a man who had been asleep 6 seconds ago. Craig Dunmore wrenched the passenger door open. The interior of the car flooded with parking lot noise and heat. Dorian Nash put both hands up, fully up, past his shoulders, palms forward. The universal language that costs a man something every time he performs it, and costs him more each time than the last. His voice came out level, not soft, not submissive, not frightened. Level, the way a combat briefing is level, because clarity saves lives, and this was not different from that in any way that mattered. I am Command Sergeant Major Dorian Nash, United States Army. I have federal identification in my left breast pocket. I am not a threat. I am asking you to allow me to show you my credentials. Reed Holloway said, "Stop talking. I have documentation that will clarify." I said, "Stop talking." Dorian Nash stopped talking. He kept his hands up. He watched Reed Holloway's face and saw nothing there that recognized him. Not the uniform he wasn't wearing, not the rank he had named, not the simple, ordinary humanity of a tired man who had been asleep in his car. He saw a conclusion that had been reached before the window was knocked on, and he understood with the clarity of a man who has survived things by reading situations accurately that talking was not going to change that conclusion. His phone was on the center console. The screen lit briefly. A notification, something ordinary, the world continuing its business. and Reed Holloway's eyes went to it, and then Reed Holloway reached through the open driver's window, picked up the phone, and dropped it face down onto the asphalt outside the car. The crack of it hitting pavement was sharp and clean. Then Reed Holloway's boot heel came down through the screen. The sound it made was the sound of something being ended. Not just a device, a connection, a record, a voice. Dorian Nash had his sister's number on that phone. He had General Pennington's number on that phone. He had photographs from the last 61 days that no one else would ever take. Small private images that soldiers keep because memory is fragile and the mind loses things. He had 14 unread messages and 2 missed calls from people who had been waiting for him to come home. All of it was under Reed Holloway's boot heel on a parking lot in the noon sun. Dorian Nash kept his hands up. Get out of the vehicle. Reed Holloway's voice had the flat authority of someone who had never been told no by someone who looked like the man he was looking at. Dorian Nash began to shift his weight to comply. The slow, visible, deliberate movement of a man demonstrating at every moment that he is not a threat, that he is following instructions, that he is giving every possible signal of cooperation. And Reed Holloway grabbed him by the collar of his gray Henley and hauled him sideways and out of the car, and Dorian Nash's knees and palms hit the asphalt with the full combined force of gravity and another man's aggression. The pavement was hot, the kind of hot that a noon sun in midsummer builds over 6 hours, stored in asphalt and released against anything that touches it. Dorian Nash felt it immediately against his palms, his knees, the side of his face. He did not struggle. He did not pull away. Craig Dunmore was at his back, and the zip ties came out and clicked tight, and Dorian Nash lay flat and still and kept his breathing even. Across the parking lot, 32 feet away, 17-year-old Kezia Tamboli had stopped walking to her mother's car. Her phone was up. The screen was recording. She had not decided to record it. She had simply raised her phone the way her generation raises their phones when something happens that the world needs to see. Instinctively, immediately, understanding before any adult near her had processed what they were watching, that this moment required a witness. Dorian Nash could see the shattered phone screen from where he lay. The fragments of glass caught the noon light and scattered it in small, precise directions, each piece holding a sliver of the overhead sun. He looked at those fragments, and he did not think about Reed Holloway. He did not think about the gun, or the zip ties, or the heat of the asphalt against his face. He thought about a sand-colored road in a country he is not permitted to name in this story, a road he had walked at dawn after a long night, and the specific quality of light on that road, and the way the men behind him had been quiet and steady and trusted him completely. He thought about what it meant to be trusted with lives. He thought about what it cost to be trustworthy and what it cost to be doubted, and how those two things lived in him simultaneously, had always lived in him simultaneously, and how today was not the first time, and that truth was both the most exhausting thing he carried and the thing that had made him, over 20 years, unbreakable. His hands stayed still. His breathing stayed even. The asphalt burned, and the noon light came straight down, and somewhere above his head, across the country, a Pentagon assistant pressed send on a Priority 1 welfare check. The machinery was already moving. Dorian Nash closed his eyes against the light and waited. The 3rd precinct of Meridian City was a building that smelled like burnt coffee and fluorescent light. If fluorescent light had a smell, which Dorian Nash had decided somewhere around his 3rd hour on foreign soil during his 2nd deployment, that it absolutely did. It was the smell of waiting rooms and processing desks and systems that moved on their own schedule, indifferent to the human being standing inside them. He stood at the intake desk with his wrists zip-tied in front of him, back straight, chin level, hands resting on the counter's edge, with the practiced neutrality of a man who had been briefed in rooms where the wrong muscle movement could end a negotiation. His gray Henley had a dark smear across the left shoulder where the asphalt had kissed it. His dark navy cargo pants had a torn seam at the right knee. He noticed both things the way a soldier notices damage to equipment. Catalogued, filed, not dwelled upon. Sergeant Pete Durbin sat behind the desk in a short-sleeved uniform shirt that had been washed too many times, the fabric pilled at the collar, his eyes fixed on a monitor that Dorian Nash could not see. Durbin was perhaps 45, with the particular brand of institutional tiredness that was not laziness but accumulation, too many identical days stacked on top of one another until a person stopped seeing the individual moments inside them. On the counter between them sat a clear plastic bag. Inside it, a brown leather wallet, a silver watch with a cracked crystal, a challenge coin, heavy brass, embossed on one side with an eagle and a set of coordinates Dorian Nash had memorized before he was allowed to touch it, given to him by a general whose name he would not say in a place like this. A common access card, a military ID, and a DD-214 folded into thirds, the paper soft at the crease from being carried close to a body for 61 consecutive days. Pete Durbin entered each item into his screen by category. Personal effects, currency, documents. He typed the word documents, hit tab, typed MISC military, and moved on. He did not open the folded paper. He did not hold the ID card up to the light. He did not read the rank printed in block letters across the top of the common access card. Dorian Nash watched him not read it. He said nothing. The holding cell was 20 feet by 12, lit from above by a panel of overhead fluorescent tubes that hummed at a frequency just below the threshold of a headache. The bench was bare metal, bolted to the wall, and the wall was painted the color of an old decision, not quite gray, not quite green, the kind of color chosen by someone who had given up on color mattering. There were two other men in the cell. The first was young, early 20s, wearing a white t-shirt and dark jeans, sneakers that had once been expensive. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees and his head slightly forward. And when Dorian Nash came in, he looked up with the automatic wariness of someone who had been in rooms like this before and had learned to read new arrivals quickly. He watched Dorian Nash cross to the far end of the bench, sit down, and settle his hands in his lap. Zip ties cut at some point between intake and here, replaced with the quiet custody of a man who no longer needed restraining because he had never needed restraining in the first place. The second man was older, perhaps 60, wearing a green flannel shirt and dark khaki pants, and he sat at the far corner of the bench with his arms folded and his eyes half closed. He was not sleeping. Dorian Nash could tell the difference. The older man was watching everything through lowered lids the way men watch things when they have learned that the cost of appearing to watch is sometimes higher than the value of seeing. The younger man said, "What you in for?" Dorian Nash said, "Sleeping in my car." A beat of silence. Then the young man let out a breath that was not quite a laugh. "That's Meridian for you. What's your name?" Dorian Nash asked. "Khalil." Dorian. Khalil looked at him for a moment, at the posture, at the way Dorian Nash's hands rested in his lap without fidgeting, at the way his eyes moved through the room with the systematic patience of someone doing a threat assessment out of habit rather than fear. Khalil said, "You military?" Dorian Nash said, "Yes." Khalil nodded slowly, the way young men nod when a piece of information lands and confirms something they already suspected. He did not ask more. The question had been asked and answered, and the answer apparently said enough. In the corner, the older man who had not yet spoken opened his eyes slightly further. He looked at Dorian Nash. He looked away. He closed his eyes again. Dorian Nash got the sense that Roy, he would learn the name later. When Roy finally said it, 2 hours into their shared silence, for no apparent reason and with no apparent expectation of conversation, had seen many things in rooms like this, and that Dorian Nash was simply one more thing he was cataloging behind those still, watchful lids. At 12:40 p.m., Dorian Nash asked for a phone call. The officer who brought the water cups, a young man in a long-sleeved uniform who moved through the cell area with the studied avoidance of someone who had been trained to process and not engage, said that the phone call would happen when processing was complete. Dorian Nash said, "Processing was complete 40 minutes ago. I watched the intake officer close the file." The officer said, "When processing is complete, sir," and left. Dorian Nash sat back against the wall. He breathed once, slowly, through his nose. He placed his hands back in his lap, rested his eyes on the middle distance, and did not let the thing rising in his chest become anything that anyone in this room needed to see. Khalil watched him do it. He said quietly, "You've done this before." The waiting, Dorian Nash said, different kind of waiting. But yes, at 12:28 p.m., a server at Fort Caldwell Secure Communications Hub registered a missed check-in flag against credential number NTX 7741D. The protocol was automated. Every special operations asset returning from a classified deployment was required to log a location confirmation within 90 minutes of departure from the base airfield. The window had opened at 11:14 a.m. when Dorian Nash's transport had touched down. The window had closed 14 minutes ago. The flag was not an alarm. It was a notation, a single red data point in a system full of data points. The kind of thing that got reviewed on a rolling basis and cleared when the asset checked in with an update. Missed check-ins happened. Traffic happened. Fatigue happened. But NTX 7741D was attached to a classification level that had its own protocol. And by 12:35 p.m., the flag had automatically escalated to a human review desk at the Pentagon's Special Operations Support Liaison Office. The woman at that desk had been doing her job for 11 years. She pulled the flag, cross-referenced the asset file, noted the classification level, and picked up her phone. By 12:41 p.m., the call had reached the executive assistant to General Arthur Pennington, a two-star commanding general who was currently in a briefing on the 6th floor of a building in Arlington, Virginia, whose precise name is not part of this story. The assistant typed a welfare check request, flagged it Priority 1, and walked it physically to the briefing room door. Generals received a great many messages during briefings. General Arthur Pennington received this one, read it in 4 seconds, and stood up. Dorian Nash asked for a phone call a second time at 1:03 p.m. The answer was the same. He returned to the bench. He sat with the patience that is not the same as acceptance, that is not the same as surrender. That is the particular muscle a person develops when they have learned, through training, through history, through the specific education of being a black man in America, that losing your composure in a space controlled by people who want you to lose your composure is the one thing you cannot afford to do. Khalil was watching him again. "You're not scared," Khalil said. It was not quite a question. Dorian Nash said, "I'm not nothing. But scared isn't the most useful thing to be right now." Khalil was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My uncle told me something like that once. He did 18 months. Said you gotta decide what you're gonna be in here before they decide it for you." Dorian Nash looked at him. Smart man. He was. The older man in the corner, Roy, opened his eyes fully for the first time since Dorian Nash had entered the cell. He looked at Dorian Nash steadily for 3 seconds, then closed his eyes again, and something in the movement of it felt, to Dorian Nash, less like dismissal and more like acknowledgement, like a man who had seen enough to recognize something real when it sat down across from him. 3 miles away, in the parking lot of the Food Max on Creston Boulevard, Kezia Tamboli was standing beside her mother's sedan with her phone in both hands, watching the thumbnail of the video she had just shot load in slow, ticking progress. She was 16. She wore a yellow t-shirt and white shorts and had been in the parking lot waiting for her mother to finish shopping when the police car had pulled in and the whole thing had unfolded in front of her in 2 minutes and 14 seconds of unavoidable clarity. She had not moved the whole time. She had held the phone still, angle steady, because her media class had taught her to keep the horizon level, even when everything else in the frame was chaos. Now she sent the video to 3 friends. Then she opened the Meridian City Community Watch Facebook group, 14,000 members, mostly people complaining about street lighting and noise ordinances, and posted the video there with one line of text. This happened at FoodMax on Creston today. The man's hands were up the whole time. She put her phone in her pocket. Her mother came out with 2 bags and a receipt. They drove home. Kezia did not tell her mother what she had done yet, because she was 16 and still believed some things were best done before asking for permission. The post already had 7 shares. At 2:14 p.m. in a classroom in Meridian City's Eastbrook High School, Simone Nash was sitting at her desk during her prep period, eating a sandwich and grading a set of lab reports on cellular respiration. She was wearing a blue denim jacket and dark brown corduroy pants, and there was a small ink mark on her left thumb that she had been meaning to wash off since 8th period yesterday. She picked up her phone and called her brother. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She assumed the voicemail was full again. It was always full. Dorian never cleared it, and sent a text instead. Just checking you made it home okay. Call me when you're up. She did not know that 3 miles from her school, her brother's phone was sitting in a clear plastic evidence bag on a shelf behind Pete Durbin's desk. Face shattered into a pattern that caught the fluorescent overhead light in small, fractured pieces. She did not know that the phone rang when her call came through. She did not know that no one in the room looked at it. At 1:17 p.m., Pete Durbin's desk phone rang. He reached for it without looking away from his screen. The practiced motion of a man who had answered this phone 10,000 times and expected it to be the same 10,000, and first thing it had always been. He said, "3rd Precinct, Durbin." A pause, then a voice, measured, precise, unhurried in the particular way of someone who had never once needed volume to command a room, said, "This is Colonel Nadia Okonkwo, Pentagon Special Operations Liaison Office. I am conducting a Priority 1 welfare check on a classified asset. I need to know if your precinct has had any contact with or has any information about a Command Sergeant Major Dorian Nash." Pete Durbin's hand went still on the mouse. He looked at the screen. He looked at the clear plastic bag on the shelf behind him. He looked at the word he had typed in the documents field. MISC Military. He picked up the phone with both hands for the first time in 4 years on this job and said, Can you hold 1 moment, ma'am?" and put her on hold before she could answer. He stared at the hold button for 2 seconds. Then he picked the phone back up, pressed the transfer button, and dialed Deputy Chief Raymond Foster's extension with the particular speed of a man who had just understood, with cold and absolute clarity, exactly what was sitting in a bag on his shelf. The caller ID on Foster's phone read, in clean block capitals, U.S. Department of Defense. The clock on the wall above Pete Durbin's desk read 1:17 p.m. In the holding cell 20 feet down the hall, Dorian Nash sat with his hands in his lap, his back straight, his eyes forward, waiting with the patience that had kept him alive in places this room could not imagine. He did not know that the machinery had already begun to move, but it had, and it was moving fast. The holding cell at Meridian City's 3rd Precinct was lit by overhead fluorescent panels that buzzed at a frequency just below consciousness, the kind of sound you only noticed when everything else went quiet. The walls were painted the particular institutional beige that no one ever chose deliberately, the color of a decision made by committee and approved without enthusiasm. A metal bench ran along 2 walls. A drain sat in the center of the floor. The light was flat and total and had no opinion about who sat beneath it. Dorian Nash sat with his back straight and his hands resting open on his knees, palms up, a habit so old He no longer registered it as deliberate. The scrapes on both palms had dried to thin rust-colored lines where the parking lot asphalt had introduced itself to his skin at speed. His gray Henley had a tear at the left elbow from the same introduction. His dark navy cargo pants were intact. He had inventoried himself twice already, the same way he inventoried his kit before a mission. Not from anxiety, but because knowing the exact state of your resources was the beginning of every plan. The young man 2 feet to his left had been watching him for 11 minutes. His name was Khalil, 22 years old, jawline still carrying the last of adolescence, eyes that had developed a particular watchfulness that young black men in certain cities either grew or didn't. He was wearing a red graphic tee and black joggers, and he had been arrested on a parking dispute that he had explained twice to no one who was listening. He had a way of holding his body that said he had been in this room before, not because he belonged in it, but because the room had decided to collect him anyway. The older man on the opposite bench was named Roy. He had offered that information and nothing else. He watched the drain in the center of the floor with the patience of a man who understood that floors did not move, and that this was more than could be said for most things. Khalil had been building to a question for 11 minutes. Dorian Nash could feel it assembling itself the way he could feel a shift in wind direction, not through any single signal, but through the accumulated texture of a space. "What they get you for?" Khalil finally asked. His voice was calibrated low, the automatic volume adjustment of a person in an institutional space. Dorian Nash looked at him. Not through him, not past him, at him, with the full attention of a man who had learned that people deserve to be actually seen when they spoke to you. "Nothing," Dorian Nash said. The word sat in the fluorescent air between them. Khalil nodded slowly, the nod of a man who had received this answer before and understood its full meaning, understood that it was not a deflection, but a precise and accurate statement of fact. He leaned back against the beige wall. "Yeah," he said quietly, "that's the one." Nothing. The word opened something in Dorian Nash's memory that he had not intended to open, and the fluorescent cell went somewhere else for a moment, became a different light entirely. He was 11 years old, and the light was afternoon and golden, falling through the oak trees on Clement Street in a St. Louis neighborhood called Sherwood Hills, where his grandmother, Eunice Nash, had lived for 31 years in a red brick house with a porch where she kept 2 chairs and a ceramic cat she had named Gerald. Dorian was walking from Gerald and the porch to the corner store 4 blocks away for a bottle of ginger ale, because his grandmother said ginger ale fixed everything that required fixing, and she was nearly always right. The school resource officer's car, white, with the district logo on the door, pulled alongside him before he reached the end of the block. The officer's name was not relevant to Dorian Nash then, and was not relevant now. What was relevant was the question the officer asked through the window, which was, "Do you live around here?" Dorian Nash had said, "My grandmother does." The officer had gotten out of the car. He had been asked where his grandmother lived, what her name was, how long she had been there. He had been asked where he had come from and where he was going. He had been asked if he had any reason to be in this neighborhood. Dorian Nash had answered every question with the careful precision of a child who had been taught by his grandmother that there were situations in which the way you held your words mattered as much as the words themselves. He had answered every question, and the officer had written something on a notepad and eventually driven away. And Dorian Nash had walked to the corner store and bought the ginger ale and walked back to the red brick house on Clement Street and said nothing to his grandmother about it, because he already understood, at 11, that telling her would only transfer the weight, not reduce it. He was 19 and the light was fluorescent and institutional, not unlike the light in this cell, falling from the drop ceiling of a university library study room at Braden College in Ohio, where Dorian Nash was in his sophomore year on a partial ROTC scholarship. He had a macroeconomics textbook open and a yellow legal pad covered in his own tight, precise handwriting, and he was the only person in study room C who had been there for more than an hour, and he was the only black man in the building's second floor, and someone, he never learned who, and the not knowing had its own particular weight, had called the campus security desk and reported a suspicious individual with a backpack who had been sitting in a study room for an extended period. The two security officers who entered study room C did not look at the textbook. They did not look at the legal pad. They looked at Dorian Nash and they asked him for his student ID, and he provided it, and they examined it longer than an ID-required examination. And one of them said, "We've had a report," and Dorian Nash said, "I'm studying." And the officer said, "We'll need you to come with us to verify." And Dorian Nash looked at the macroeconomics textbook and the legal pad and the study room that he had reserved through the library's online system at 8:47 that morning, and he closed the textbook with the same controlled quiet that would one day make him an exceptional soldier, and he went with them, and he verified, and he returned to study room C and finished his notes and received a B+ on the exam, and never once reported the incident because he already knew at 19 the particular mathematics of those reports. He was 24, and the light was the pale morning light of Fort Caldwell, Kansas. And he was in his first week of his first posting after completing advanced individual training with marks that had prompted his commanding sergeant to use the word exceptional twice in one conversation, which was not a word that Sergeant used carelessly. He was driving a 2009 Ford Escort he had bought from a fellow trainee for $3,600, and he was wearing his Class B uniform, olive green shirt, dark trousers, the creases his grandmother had taught him to press. And he was pulled over on Route 14, which was the main road between the base's south gate and the town of Caldwell proper. The officer said, "Do you know why I stopped you?" Dorian Nash said, "No, sir." The officer said, "Tail light." Dorian Nash checked the tail light the next morning. It was fully functional. He was pulled over 3 more times that month. Different roads, different officers, different explanations, same car, same uniform, same man, same outcome. After the 4th stop, a fellow soldier named Marcus Webb, who had been at Fort Caldwell for 2 years, found Dorian Nash in the mess hall and sat across from him and said, without preamble, "You gotta understand something about this town." Dorian Nash had looked at Marcus Webb and understood that Marcus Webb was not offering a solution. He was offering a map of a terrain that did not change, only became more familiar. Dorian Nash had folded that map and kept it. He still had it. Back in the fluorescent present of the holding cell, Dorian Nash returned to his hands on his knees. Khalil was looking at his phone, which had not been confiscated because Khalil's arrest was a parking dispute, and parking disputes had a different administrative temperature than the arrest of a man in a parking lot with military credentials. Roy was still watching the drain. Dorian Nash breathed in, breathed out. 40 feet away and 2 floors up, Reed Holloway was sitting at a precinct workstation under the same fluorescent panels, typing his incident report with the 2-fingered method he had never bothered to correct. He was wearing his short-sleeve uniform shirt, badge centered, collar straight, the uniform of a man who moved through the world certain of his position in it. The incident report described the subject as appearing disoriented and agitated. It described the approach as standard welfare check protocol. It described the subject's failure to comply with verbal commands. It used the phrase physical compliance necessary twice. It did not mention the phone being stepped on, because Reed Holloway had filed the phone under evidence rather than under conduct. A bureaucratic maneuver so habitual he no longer registered it as a choice. Craig Dunmore sat at the workstation beside him, his own keyboard untouched. Craig Dunmore was 31 years old and had been on the force for 6 years and had a daughter who was 4 and a wife who was a physical therapist and a mortgage on a house in a neighborhood he considered good, by which he meant safe, by which he meant familiar. He was not a cruel man. He had never initiated anything. In 6 years, he had filed exactly 0 complaints against a fellow officer and had received 0 complaints himself. And this was the record of a man who understood that there was a version of this job you could do by staying inside the lines, and the lines were drawn by other people. And Craig Dunmore had decided, at some point so early he could no longer locate the decision, that the lines were not his problem. He stared at his keyboard now and did not type. He had watched the phone get stepped on. He had watched the zip ties go on wrists that were raised. He had watched the asphalt receive a man who had not resisted, not cursed, not done anything other than exist in a parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon and speak with a composure that he now recognized made Reed Holloway angrier rather than calmer, because composure in that direction was not something Reed Holloway's training had prepared him to interpret as anything other than defiance. Craig Dunmore opened a new incident report form on his screen. He put his fingers on the keys. He stared at the empty form for 45 seconds. He closed it. He stood up and said he was getting coffee, and walked to the break room and stood in front of the machine and did not make coffee. The silence he carried was its own kind of document. In the precinct lobby, a man in his mid-60s with a gray blazer over a blue-collared shirt and dark trousers was standing at the front desk with the particular energy of a person who had learned patience not as a personality trait, but as a tactical choice. His name was Wallace Grimes, and he had retired from the city council 4 years ago. And he had seen many things in those years, but he had been returning a grocery cart at the Foodmax lot at 12:14 p.m., and what he had seen there had required 3 phone calls before he even reached his car. He had already called his former council colleague. He had called a pastor who ran a community mediation center on 18th Street. He had called a woman who ran the neighborhood association in the 3rd Precinct's district. Now he was here, speaking to a desk officer named Sims, with the measured clarity of a man who had conducted more public meetings than Sims had attended, saying, "I witnessed this arrest. I want to speak to a supervisor. I will wait as long as necessary." Officer Sims told him someone would be with him shortly. Wallace Grimes said, "I know. I'll be right here." He sat in the plastic chair beside the front desk and placed his hands on his knees, and he looked at the fluorescent lobby ceiling, and he waited. Across the city, in a conference room on the 4th floor of Meridian City Hall, where the overhead lights were recessed and warm, and the skylight above the central table was letting in the full weight of the early afternoon sun, Chief Bernard Calloway's phone buzzed against the polished table. He was in a budget meeting, and he did not look at it immediately because Bernard Calloway had the discipline of a man who understood the theater of institutional authority, which required not checking your phone in meetings. He looked at it. 90 seconds later, the internal alert was brief. It referenced an intake. It referenced pending inquiries. It used the phrase federal interest in a way that had no specificity yet, and therefore had every specificity at once. Bernard Calloway looked at the budget figures on the screen at the far end of the room and did not see them. In the cell, Dorian Nash closed his eyes. He was not sleeping. He had not slept since the parking lot, and he would not sleep in this room because sleep was not available to him in any room where the geometry of the situation had not been established as safe, and this room's geometry was still being established. He began instead at the beginning. "I am an American, fighting in the forces which guard my country and our way of life." The words moved through him without effort, occupying the same mental space that controlled breathing occupied. Automatic and deliberate at once. "I am prepared to give my life in their defense." He had first memorized the Code of Conduct at 22, and the memorization had been formal, required, assessed. But somewhere in the years between 22 and 34, the words had undergone a transformation that no instructor had prepared him for. They had become less a declaration of military duty and more a portable architecture, a structure he could stand inside when the external structures failed him. If I am captured, I will continue to resist by all means available. He was in a holding cell in a city in the country he had served. He had scrapes on his hands from a parking lot. His military credentials were in an evidence bag because no one had read them. I will make every effort to escape and to aid others to escape. He did not mean escape physically. He meant the other kind, the one that required staying exactly where you were, completely intact, until the situation resolved itself around your refusal to become less than what you were. I will accept neither parole nor special favors from the enemy. Khalil, beside him, had quietly fallen asleep against the wall, his head tipped back, breathing even. Roy watched the drain. Dorian Nash ran the words. The fluorescent light had no opinion. The Pentagon does not panic. That is the first thing you need to understand about what happened at 1:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in Meridian City. The Pentagon does not panic. It does not plead, and it does not ask twice. When the United States Department of Defense decides that something requires immediate attention, it moves with the quiet, hydraulic certainty of a machine that has never once needed to raise its voice to be obeyed. What descended on the 3rd Precinct that afternoon was not a storm. It was a pressure system, and Sergeant Pete Durbin felt it the moment he picked up the phone. Pete Durbin had worked the intake desk at the 3rd Precinct for 11 years. He had taken calls from angry parents, from city council assistants, from insurance adjusters and public defenders, and, once, from a sitting state senator who had very strong feelings about a parking ticket. He had developed, over those 11 years, a particular immunity to urgency. People always thought their situation was the most important situation. Pete Durbin had learned not to agree. He answered the call at 1:17 p.m. the same way he answered every call. 3rd Precinct. Durbin speaking. The voice on the other end was a woman's voice, and it was calm in the way that certain very deep rivers are calm. Not because nothing is moving beneath the surface, but because whatever is moving has no need to announce itself. She said, "This is Colonel Nadia Okonkwo, Pentagon Liaison Office, Defense Intelligence Directorate. I am conducting a Priority 1 welfare check on a classified special operations asset. I need to know whether your precinct has had any contact with or detained any individual matching the following description in the past 2 hours." Pete Durbin straightened in his chair. He did not do this consciously. His spine simply made the decision without consulting him. She said the name. Command Sergeant Major Dorian Nash. Pete Durbin looked at his intake log. He looked at it for approximately 2 seconds. Then he said, "Colonel, I'm going to transfer you immediately to a supervisor. Please hold." To his credit, he did not put her on hold for long. He transferred the call upward before his hand had fully left the receiver, and he did it with the particular speed of a man who has suddenly and clearly understood that the ground beneath his desk is not as solid as it was 60 seconds ago. The call moved through the precinct's internal hierarchy, the way electricity moves through copper. Fast, purposeful, and incapable of stopping. It bypassed Lieutenant Carruthers, who was in a use-of-force seminar and could not be reached. It bypassed Captain Yi, who took one look at the transferred notation. Pentagon, Priority welfare check, special op asset, and immediately kicked it further up the chain. By 1:23 p.m., 6 minutes after Colonel Okonkwo first dialed, the call landed on the desk of Deputy Chief Raymond Foster. Raymond Foster was 54 years old, 28 years on the force, and he had the particular stillness of a man who had seen enough in his career to know when something was irreversible. He picked up the phone. He listened. He did not interrupt Colonel Okonkwo once. When she finished, he said, "Colonel, I'm pulling our intake records right now. Give me 3 minutes." He pulled the intake log on his desktop terminal. He scrolled to 12:41 p.m. He found the name. He found the booking number. He clicked through to the evidence inventory attached to the processing record, and he read the list of personal effects that had been logged, bagged, and shelved without examination. 1 black leather wallet, 1 analog wristwatch, black band, 1 military common access card, 1 Department of Defense identification card bearing the name and rank of Command Sergeant Major Dorian Nash, 1 folded document identified in the log simply as papers, 1 challenge coin, gold and dark blue, with an insignia the intake officer had not recognized and had not thought to look up. Raymond Foster went very still. Not the stillness of confusion, the stillness of a man who has just understood, with perfect and unwelcome clarity, exactly how large a problem is sitting inside his building. He picked up his desk phone. He called Bernard Calloway's personal cell. When the chief answered, mid-sentence in a City Hall budget meeting, Raymond Foster said 4 words: "You need to leave." The flatness in his deputy's voice communicated everything that those 4 words did not say aloud, and Bernard Calloway excused himself from the meeting without finishing his sentence. 3 miles away, in a corner booth of a coffee shop on Hadley Street, a journalist named Tara Kim was on her 2nd cup of coffee and watching a 2-minute and 14-second video on her laptop for the 4th time in a row. The video was shaky for the first 8 seconds. Whoever had filmed it was moving, adjusting, finding a stable position, and then it locked, and the overhead noon light of the Foodmax parking lot flooded the frame with the flat, unforgiving clarity of a courtroom exhibit. Tara Kim had been covering Meridian City for 6 years. She had written about police accountability 4 times. Twice, her editors had softened her conclusions. Once, a story had been killed entirely. She had learned, in those 6 years, to recognize the difference between a story that would make noise for a news cycle and a story that would not go away. She watched Dorian Nash's hands, raised and open, for the entirety of the 2 minutes and 14 seconds. She watched the phone placement, deliberate, careful, placed on the console like an offering before the hammer came down on it. She watched the zip ties. She watched the asphalt. She opened a new email. She typed her editor's name in the address line. She typed the subject: "We need to talk about this video right now." She attached the link, hit send, and then immediately called instead of waiting for a reply, because some stories do not wait. The video had been shared 340 times by 1:15 p.m. By 1:30, it was approaching 500. The local Facebook group where Kezia Tamboli had first posted it, a community page called Meridian City Neighbors, had originally been created to share garage sale announcements and lost pet alerts. Its moderators were, at that moment, watching the notification counter climb and doing absolutely nothing to stop it, because some things are larger than moderation policies. Inside the 3rd precinct, in a holding cell on the building's north side, the afternoon light came through a narrow window set high in the wall, casting a clean white rectangle across the painted cinder block floor. The cell held 3 men. Khalil sat near the door. The older man named Roy sat in the corner, watching, as he had been watching for 2 hours. Dorian Nash sat on the metal bench along the far wall, back straight, feet flat on the floor, eyes closed. He was not sleeping. Khalil had figured that out an hour ago. The man breathed too evenly, held too still, occupied the silence with a deliberate precision that had nothing to do with rest. He was somewhere else in his mind. Not gone, not checked out, but stored somewhere safe while he waited. Khalil had asked him earlier, quietly, what branch? Dorian Nash had said Army, without opening his eyes. Khalil had nodded and left him alone after that, because the answer carried a weight that made the question feel small. Dorian Nash was at that moment reciting, not aloud. In the ordered chambers of his mind, he was moving through the Army's soldier's creed, word by word, the way another man might count a rosary. It was not desperation, it was maintenance. He had learned over 4 deployments and 11 years of service that the mind under sustained stress is a machine that requires calibration, and that the specific language of discipline, memorized, precise, load-bearing, was one of the most reliable tools he possessed. He had used it in a vehicle, in a country he could not name in this story, when the darkness outside the armored glass was absolute and the mission had gone quiet in a way that meant something was wrong. He used it now, in a fluorescent cell in his own city, because the principle was the same. Stay calibrated. Stay present. Wait for the machinery to complete its cycle. The door opened at 1:31 p.m. It was not Reed Holloway. The officer who opened the door was a younger man, someone Dorian Nash had not seen before, wearing a short-sleeved uniform shirt and carrying himself with the particular discomfort of someone who has been assigned an errand he does not fully understand but has been told is important. He looked at Dorian Nash and said his name with a formal precision that had been entirely absent from every interaction Dorian Nash had experienced in this building for the past 50 minutes. Dorian Nash opened his eyes. He did not stand immediately. He looked at the officer for one measured moment, and the officer, to his credit, did not look away. Then Dorian Nash stood. He straightened to his full height, squared his shoulders, and the change in the room was immediate and physical, not aggressive, not performed, simply a man returning to his correct dimensions after a long time being required to make himself smaller. Khalil watched this from across the cell and said nothing, but his jaw tightened briefly because he recognized what he was seeing. Dorian Nash said, "I'd like my phone call now." The officer said, "Sir, the deputy chief would like to speak with you personally. If you'll come with me." Dorian Nash said, "I'd like my phone call first." The officer hesitated. Not long, 2 seconds, perhaps 3. But the hesitation was there, and it was significant because it meant the officer was calculating whether he had the authority to deny the request given whatever had just changed on the floors above them. The calculation resolved quickly. The officer stepped aside and said, "Yes, sir. Right this way." They walked him to a room off the main processing corridor. Not the holding area, not an interview room, but a small administrative space with a desk, a chair, and a landline phone sitting in the overhead fluorescent light, like an ordinary object that was about to be used for something extraordinary. The officer told him he could use the phone. Then the officer stepped back, but did not leave the room, because he had not been told to leave the room. And Dorian Nash noticed this, but said nothing about it. He picked up the receiver. He did not ask for a phone book. He did not ask an operator for assistance. He dialed 11 digits from memory, digits he had memorized 4 years ago, after a situation in a desert location that had taught him with perfect and lasting clarity that there are moments when the difference between 30 seconds and 3 minutes is everything. The number rang once. General Arthur Pennington answered on the first ring. Dorian Nash said, "Sir, this is Nash. I'm at the Meridian City 3rd Precinct, 4400 Garfield Boulevard." The officer standing in the corner of the room heard the name Nash and went very still. He had, in the past 10 minutes, heard that name spoken with a quality of institutional alarm that he had never previously encountered in this building, and hearing Nash speak it himself, in that quiet and precise voice, produced an effect that the officer would not have been able to fully articulate, but would not forget. He spoke for under 90 seconds. He gave the general the address, the arresting officers' names, the approximate timeline, and a factual account of the incident that contained no editorializing, no elevation of tone, and no request for anything specific, because Command Sergeant Major Dorian Nash did not make requests of that nature. He gave a situation report. He gave it the same way he would give one in a forward operating base, or in a secured vehicle, or crouched behind cover in a place he could not name, because the situation was what the situation was, and clarity was the only tool that mattered. The general said one thing before the operational response. "Are you injured?" Dorian Nash looked at his palms. The scrapes from the asphalt were dried now, shallow, already beginning to close the way a body insists on doing regardless of whether the circumstances that caused the damage have been resolved. He said, "Scrapes on my palms and knees from the pavement, nothing requiring treatment." The general said, "Don't sign anything. Morrow will be there in 40 minutes. Then the call ended. It lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The officer standing in the corner of the room had expected raised voices, had expected the theatrical declaration of consequence that people imagine powerful men make in private moments. He had not expected the quiet. He would think about that quiet for a long time afterward, the way it occupied the room after Dorian Nash set the receiver down, the way it felt less like an absence of sound and more like the specific, pressurized silence that exists in the moment before something very large begins to move. Dorian Nash set the phone down on the desk. He turned to face the officer. He stood in the overhead fluorescent light of that administrative room, gray Henley, dark navy cargo pants, palms scarred from a parking lot and from places further away than that, and he looked at the officer with an expression that was not anger and was not triumph, and was not the performance of either. He said, "I'll need a pen and a piece of paper. I'd like to begin writing down everything I remember about this afternoon while it's still clear." The officer produced both. Dorian Nash sat down at the desk and began to write, and the machinery of consequence, already moving above his head and across the country, continued its rotation toward this building and everything inside it. He had not been rescued. He had not waited to be rescued. He had made one phone call from memory, given one factual report, and set down a receiver. The rest would follow. He knew it would follow because he had spent 11 years learning exactly how far the weight of prepared authority could travel when it was finally aimed in the right direction. He wrote in a clear, even hand. The fluorescent light was bright overhead. Outside the narrow window set high in the wall, the afternoon sun of Meridian City continued without interruption, indifferent and illuminating, the way it had been at noon in a grocery store parking lot when everything that was coming had already, quietly, begun. The phone sat in Dorian Nash's hand like something borrowed. A desk phone, gray plastic, the kind that had been sitting on government-issue furniture since before half the officers in this building had entered the academy. The receiver was cool against his palm, which was the first comfortable sensation he had felt in hours. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed at their steady institutional frequency, throwing flat white light across the small room they had placed him in. Not a cell, not quite an office, something in between, a beige room with a single table and 2 chairs that smelled like burnt coffee and document dust. Officer Tamara Wicks, who had escorted him here with a formality entirely absent from the officers who had put him on the asphalt, stood near the door with her hands clasped in front of her. 2 other officers, whose names Dorian Nash had not been given, stood in the doorway. All 3 were listening. Dorian Nash knew they were listening. He dialed anyway. It rang once. "Nash?" General Arthur Pennington's voice came through the receiver with the particular density of a man who had been waiting. Not waiting by the phone. A man like Pennington did not wait by phones, waiting in the way that senior commanders wait, actively, with the machinery of response already in motion before the situation fully declares itself. "Sir." Dorian Nash's voice was level. "3rd Precinct, Meridian City Police Department. Address is 140 Garfield Avenue. Arresting officers are Reed Holloway and Craig Dunmore. I was detained at approximately 12:14 p.m. in the parking lot of a Foodmax on Crescent Boulevard. I was asleep in my vehicle following transit from Fort Caldwell. Officers approached, escalated without cause, destroyed my phone before I could place or receive a call, and brought me in zip-tied. My documents were logged into evidence without examination. I have been here approximately 2 hours. A pause that lasted exactly 2 seconds. Are you injured? Scrapes on my palms and knees from the asphalt. Nothing requiring treatment. Don't sign anything. The general's voice did not change in pitch or volume. It was the same voice he used to brief casualty reports and commendation ceremonies and everything in between. A voice that had long ago burned away the register of surprise. I'll have Morrow there in 40 minutes. You hold. Yes, sir. Nash. Sir, good work on the report. The line went dead. Dorian Nash set the receiver back in its cradle with the same care he used for everything, the same deliberate placement he gave to his rifle, his gear, his men. He did not look at the officers in the doorway immediately. He took one breath, let it settle through his chest, and then he looked up. Officer Wicks had a careful expression. The two officers in the doorway had expressions that were harder to categorize, something between deflation and confusion, the look of men who had expected a detonation and received a weather report instead. One of them shifted his weight. The other looked at the floor. Dorian Nash understood this. He had seen it before, not in this room, but in rooms like it. Rooms where people had wanted him to perform rage or desperation or grief because those performances would have made him legible in a way they were comfortable with. A shouting man could be dismissed. A crying man could be pitied and forgotten. A man who gave a 90-second situation report to a general and then placed the receiver down without a tremor in his hand. That man sat in the room with them like a question they did not know how to ask. He folded his hands on the table and waited. The quiet, as it turned out, was worse. Even Dorian Nash knew that. 3 floors above the holding level, in a corner office whose window faced Meridian City's downtown skyline in the full glare of the early afternoon sun, Chief Bernard Calloway was watching a 2-minute and 14-second video for the 4th time. The footage was phone quality, but daylight sharp. Flat noon sun with no shadows to hide in. The parking lot's white line markings visible beneath Dorian Nash's silver Honda Pilot. Bernard Calloway had watched it the first time quickly, the second time slowly, and the third time with Reed Holloway's incident report open beside his laptop. The 4th time, he watched it without any documents at all, just the video. Just what was actually there. Dorian Nash's hands were up. From the moment the driver's door opened, they were up, and they stayed up, and the narration Bernard Calloway ran in his own head, the one Reed Holloway had supplied him, did not survive contact with what he was looking at. The phone, placed deliberately on the console. The passenger door wrenched open by Craig Dunmore, while Reed Holloway already had his weapon drawn. The zip ties, the asphalt, a man in a gray Henley and dark navy cargo pants, face down on a parking lot in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, his hands bound behind him, while grocery shoppers stood frozen with their carts, and a teenager held her phone steady with the calm focus of someone who understood that what she was seeing mattered. Bernard Calloway closed the laptop. He was a large man, wide through the shoulders, with a face that had been trained over 30 years into an expression of measured authority. He wore a white dress shirt and dark charcoal trousers today, his badge on his belt, his office arranged with the particular intentionality of a man who understood the power of visible symbols, commendations on the wall, a framed photo with the mayor, 3 years of department anniversary plaques in a precise row. He pressed the intercom on his desk. "Get me Holloway and Dunmore, now." They came in 4 minutes. Reed Holloway, in his long-sleeved uniform, badge straight, chin level, the posture of a man who had already composed his version of events and was prepared to deliver it. Craig Dunmore 1 step behind him, in his short-sleeved uniform, and Bernard Calloway noticed, not for the first time, that Craig Dunmore always entered a room 1 step behind Reed Holloway, always, as if proximity to certainty was its own form of cover. "Walk me through it," Bernard Calloway said. Reed Holloway walked him through it. the vehicle idling, the subject unresponsive to initial contact, the window engagement, the subject appearing disoriented and agitated, the failure to clearly identify himself, the perceived reach toward the center console, the necessary escalation. His voice carried the particular texture of a man giving testimony he believed, not the rehearsed smoothness of a lie, but the blunt forward pressure of conviction. Bernard Calloway listened to all of it. He watched Reed Holloway's face the entire time. That was when it happened. That was the moment Bernard Calloway would carry out of this room and into every room that came after it for the rest of his career. Reed Holloway was not lying. The man genuinely could not see the gap. He had watched the same parking lot, stood in the same noon light, encountered the same man, and what he had seen, what he continued to see, was a threat that required neutralization, not a soldier, not a decorated veteran on his first sleep in 61 hours, not a man with a common access card in his breast pocket and a general's phone number memorized in his head. A threat, a disoriented, agitated, non-compliant subject who needed to be controlled. Bernard Calloway had spent 22 years building a department, hiring cycles, training programs, use of force policy reviews, community liaison initiatives that he had presented at 4 consecutive city council sessions with charts and talking points and language borrowed from national best practice frameworks. He had done all of that. He was on record doing all of that. And Reed Holloway sat in front of him with absolutely no idea that any of it was supposed to change what he had done this morning, because it hadn't. Because none of it had actually changed the thing that needed changing, which was not policy language or training hour requirements, but the foundational assumption that Reed Holloway carried onto every call, into every parking lot, at every window of every car driven by a black man in Meridian City. Bernard Calloway had trained Reed Holloway. He had signed off on Reed Holloway's field evaluations. He had reviewed the 3 prior complaints, reviewed them, found them within departmental guidelines, filed them, moved on. He had built the instrument. He had sharpened it. He had handed it to Reed Holloway and Craig Dunmore and sent them out into the city. "That will be all," Bernard Calloway said. His own voice surprised him. It was very quiet. Reed Holloway and Craig Dunmore left. Craig Dunmore glanced back once from the doorway, and Bernard Calloway caught it. Not defiance, not guilt exactly, but the look of a man who had known something was wrong and had chosen, moment after moment, to stand one step behind someone who wasn't. Bernard Calloway held that glance for a full second and then looked away, because there was a version of Craig Dunmore that Bernard Calloway recognized too well, and that recognition did not help him right now. He reached for his phone and called the city's legal team. At 2:31 p.m., the precinct's front entrance opened, and Renata Chisholm walked through it. She was wearing a white blazer over a deep burgundy blouse and charcoal trousers, and she carried a leather attaché that she held at her side with the ease of someone who had never once needed to use it as a prop. She was 44 years old, had spent 8 years as a JAG attorney before moving into private practice, and she moved through the fluorescent-lit lobby of the 3rd Precinct the way she moved through every room she entered, as if she had already read the building's file and found it wanting. Officer Wicks met her at the desk. There was a brief exchange that lasted less than 45 seconds, during which Renata Chisholm produced 2 forms of identification and a letter of representation on firm letterhead, stated that she was here to meet with her client, Command Sergeant Major Dorian Nash, and waited with the particular patience of a woman who had learned long ago that waiting was not the same as deferring. She was escorted to the beige room. Dorian Nash stood when she entered, not from deference, from habit, the reflex of a man whose body had been trained to mark entrances and acknowledge the arrival of allies. Renata Chisholm crossed the room in 4 steps, extended her hand, and he shook it. Her grip was firm. His was too. "Command Sergeant Major Nash," she said. "I'm Renata Chisholm. I was a JAG attorney for 8 years and I have been in private civil rights practice for 6. General Pennington's office contacted mine 40 minutes ago. She set the attaché on the table, opened it, and removed a legal pad and a pen. She sat down across from him. The overhead fluorescent light caught the silver clip on her pen as she uncapped it. "Tell me everything," she said. "In order." Dorian Nash sat back down. He placed his hands on the table, palms up, the scrapes on both still faintly visible, dried now, the skin tight at the edges. He looked at Renata Chisholm directly. He started with the parking lot. The time, 12:14 p.m. The position of his seat. The state of the engine. He described Reed Holloway's knuckle on the glass and the holster clear of the weapon. Before the sentence ended, he described Craig Dunmore at the passenger door, the phone on the console, placed there deliberately, his hands at shoulder height, his voice level, his rank stated clearly, the phone screen crushed under a boot, the asphalt. Renata Chisholm wrote without looking at the pad. Her eyes stayed on Dorian Nash's face, reading him the way she read every client. Not for emotion, because emotion was not evidence, but for precision. She was looking for the man whose account would hold under every condition that was coming. And what she found, 4 sentences in, was a man who had been giving precise accounts under extreme conditions for 22 years. She was already constructing the complaint before he reached the part about the cell. She was already 3 motions ahead, already seeing the federal filing, already mapping the institutional exposure, already reading Bernard Calloway's future in the gap between Reed Holloway's incident report and Kezia Tamboli's video. She let Dorian Nash finish. Every word. She did not interrupt once. When he stopped, she capped the pen. "Command Sergeant Major Nash," she said, and her voice carried something that was not quite warmth and not quite severity, but lived precisely between them. The tone of a person who took both the situation and the person in front of them with equal seriousness. "What was done to you today was wrong. It was documented, and it is actionable on multiple federal levels. I want you to understand something clearly." She held his gaze. "You will not be defending yourself in this. From this moment forward, we are not defending. We are moving forward." Dorian Nash looked at her for a long moment. Outside the beige room, through the closed door, the precinct continued its afternoon operations. Phones, footsteps, the muffled exchange of shift change, ordinary institutional sounds. The sounds of a place that did not yet fully understand what had just walked through its front door. He nodded once. "Then let's begin," he said. The video was 2 minutes and 14 seconds long. That was the first thing every reporter noted when they described it. Not the content, not the outcome, but the duration. 2 minutes and 14 seconds. The length of a pop song. The length of a commercial break. The length of time it takes to pour a cup of coffee, check your messages, and look up again at the world. 2 minutes and 14 seconds was enough time to change everything, because every second of those 2 minutes and 14 seconds was clear, steady, and impossible to argue with. Kezia Tamboli had filmed it on her phone from the far side of the Food Max parking lot, standing between 2 parked cars in the flat. Overhead noon light that left no shadows and told no lies. The sun was directly above the lot at 12:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, and it illuminated the scene the way a courtroom illuminates evidence, without mercy and without favor. The parking lot's pale concrete acted as a reflector, bouncing light upward, filling every corner of the frame with the kind of brightness that made excuses impossible. The video showed Dorian Nash's hands. That was the first thing anyone who watched it said afterward. His hands were up before Reed Holloway's knuckle even finished its second knock on the glass. Up and open, palms forward, fingers spread, the universal grammar of a man who understood the assignment and had decided to survive it. His gray Henley stretched across his shoulders as he raised both arms, and those arms stayed raised for the entirety of what followed. They did not drop. They did not reach. They did not do anything that any reasonable person watching the footage could describe as threatening. The video showed the phone. This was the detail that would replay on cable news more than any other. Dorian Nash had set his phone on the center console with a deliberateness that was almost ceremonial. The careful, slow placement of a man who understood that every movement was being watched and evaluated and potentially used against him. He had set it down gently with 2 fingers, the way you set down a glass on a surface you don't want to scratch. And then Reed Holloway's boot had come through the passenger door that Craig Dunmore wrenched open from the outside, and the phone screen had shattered against the console edge with a crack that Kezia Tamboli's microphone picked up clearly enough that 3 audio engineers would later confirm it in sworn depositions. By 4 p.m., 3 regional news stations had the video. A producer at Channel 7 had found it in the Meridian City Community Facebook group while running routine social media monitoring for afternoon stories. She had watched it once, then walked directly to her editor's office without stopping to refill her coffee. By 4:22 p.m., Channel 7 was running a lower third chyron that read breaking, Army veteran detained in Meridian City grocery store parking lot. By 4:45 p.m., Channels 4 and 11 had the same footage from different sources. The video had been shared enough times that sourcing it had become irrelevant. Tara Kim, the journalist who had found Kezia Tamboli's video early that afternoon, had spent 4 hours on the phone before she published a single word. She called the 3rd Precinct, the City Communications Office, the Army Public Affairs Office at Fort Caldwell, and a former JAG attorney she trusted to explain what a DD-214 was and what a common access card meant in terms of federal identity. She called Wallace Grimes, who had been standing in the precinct lobby for most of the afternoon and was willing to go on record with everything he had seen. She called 2 neighbors of the Foodmax who had been in the parking lot. She called the Pentagon media line and received a response that was 3 sentences long and contained, in its careful bureaucratic construction, more confirmation than a press conference would have provided. She published at 5:47 p.m. The headline read, Army Special Operations, Soldier Dragged from Car at Gunpoint Outside Meridian City Grocery Store. By 6 p.m., the story was national. The video moved across the internet the way important things move, not gradually, but in a sudden, irreversible surge. The way a dam doesn't leak and then fails, and then floods. It was everywhere simultaneously, on every platform, in every format, clipped and shared and quoted and captioned and embedded in articles that were being written faster than they could be edited. People who had never heard of Meridian City were watching 2 minutes and 14 seconds of flat noon light in a grocery store parking lot. And what they were watching was not complicated. It did not require context or explanation or a background in law enforcement procedure. It required only eyes and the willingness to believe what those eyes showed them. Dorian Nash was watching none of it. He was sitting in a consultation room on the 2nd floor of the 3rd Precinct with Renata Chisholm across the table from him. And the only screen in the room was her laptop, which was open to a legal document she was drafting in real time while he spoke. She had arrived at 2:31 p.m. in a white blazer and charcoal trousers with a leather attaché that she set on the table with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and intended to do it completely. She had listened to everything he said without interrupting. She had asked 4 follow-up questions, each one precise and purposeful, like surgical tools selected for a specific task. She had told him what she was going to file, when she was going to file it, and what it would require from him. She had not told him to be patient or to trust the process or that things would be okay, because she was not that kind of attorney, and she understood that he was not that kind of man. Outside, the precinct parking lot was filling. Wallace Grimes had not called it a protest. He had called it, in the 3 phone calls and 2 text messages he sent between 4 p.m. and 5:30 p.m., a witnessing. The distinction mattered to him, And he made it clearly. They were not there to disrupt, not there to demand, not there yet for any of the things that would come later. They were there to be present, to stand in the light and refuse to be invisible, while a man inside those walls had been made invisible. There were 40 people at 5 p.m., standing on the sidewalk and in the edges of the parking lot under the overhead fluorescent fixtures that lined the precinct's exterior, the kind of institutional lighting that turns everything it touches into evidence. By 5:30 p.m. there were 80. By the time Simone Nash pulled into the precinct visitor lot at 6:28 p.m., having driven 17 minutes from her school, after seeing the video in the staff group chat at 6:09 p.m., there were 120 people standing in that fluorescent glow, with their phones raised, not filming confrontation, not documenting anything dramatic, simply holding light up in the same way that Kezia Tamboli had held light up, as a form of testimony, as a refusal to let the record go unwitnessed. Simone Nash was wearing a yellow cardigan and dark jeans. She had not gone home to change. She had grabbed her car keys and her phone from her classroom desk, and she had driven directly here. And the yellow of the cardigan was vivid under the parking lot lights as she moved through the crowd, saying "excuse me" quietly, making her way toward the precinct entrance. She had called Dorian Nash's phone 11 times. She knew this because her phone showed her the call log. 11 unanswered calls spanning from 12:33 p.m. to 4:45 p.m., after which she had stopped because she had seen the video and understood that the calls were going to a phone that no longer had a screen. She had watched the video twice. The second time she had watched it, she was sitting in her classroom during a free period, and the overhead lights in the empty room were very bright, and she had not cried, which surprised her. She had felt instead a stillness that she recognized from other moments in her life, from the morning their grandmother had called to tell her something had happened, from the day Dorian deployed the first time, from all the moments that were too large for an immediate response and required instead a period of simple breath before the body knew what to do next. She was walking through the precinct lobby door when she saw him. He was coming out of the elevator with Renata Chisholm beside him, and he was wearing the same gray Henley from the video, and his hands were at his sides, and he was upright, which was the first thing she checked. Always with Dorian, the first thing she checked was whether he was upright. He saw her at almost the same moment she saw him, and something crossed his face that was not quite expressible in language, something that was recognition and relief, and the particular grief of being seen by someone who loves you after a thing has happened that you have not yet fully processed yourself. Simone Nash stopped walking. She stopped for 3 full seconds. 3 seconds in which the lobby's fluorescent light pressed down on both of them from above, and the murmur of the building continued around them, and Renata Chisholm stepped 1/2 step to the side with the discretion of a person who understood exactly what she was witnessing. 3 seconds, and then Simone Nash was moving again, and she walked directly into her brother's arms, and neither of them said anything. The embrace lasted a long time. It was not a dramatic embrace. It was not the kind of embrace that plays well on camera or resolves neatly into a single image. It was the kind of embrace that belongs only to people who have been frightened for each other and are now close enough to confirm that the fear was survivable. Dorian Nash's chin rested on top of his sister's head. His eyes were open. He was looking at the lobby's far wall, at nothing particular, with an expression that was not peace but was something adjacent to it, the particular stillness of a person who has been holding a great deal of tension and has just been given, not release but company. When they separated, Simone Nash looked at her brother's face and said, "I called your phone so many times." Dorian Nash said, "I know. I'm sorry." That was all. That was the whole conversation, and it was enough, because the apology was not for the phone, and not for the video, and not for any of the hours between 12:14 p.m. and this lobby. It was an apology for the 3 seconds of fear she had carried, which he had not been able to prevent, which was its own kind of grief for a man who had spent 2 decades being very deliberate about preventing harm. On the 3rd floor of the same building, Bernard Calloway was on the phone. He had been on the phone in various configurations for the last 4 hours. He had spoken to the city's legal team, the mayor's chief of staff, his own communications director, and a former colleague who now worked for a law enforcement liability insurance firm. He had watched Tara Kim's article load on his screen at 5:52 p.m. and had read it twice, once quickly and once slowly, and the second reading was the one that told him what the first reading had confirmed. The gap between Reed Holloway's incident report and the 2 minutes and 14 seconds of parking lot footage was not a gap that any press statement could bridge. He had placed Reed Holloway on administrative leave at 5:15 p.m. before the article published, before the national spread, before the 120 people assembled in his parking lot. He told himself this mattered, that acting before the pressure arrived was different from acting because of the pressure. He told himself this, and he was not certain he believed it, and the uncertainty was new for him, which made it uncomfortable in a way that political ambition usually prevented. The decision had not been made for Dorian Nash. Bernard Calloway was honest enough with himself, in the privacy of his 3rd-floor office, with its overhead fluorescent lights and its window overlooking the people standing in his parking lot, to admit that the decision had been made because the video was national, because the legal exposure was severe, because the mayor's chief of staff had used the words federal oversight in a tone that meant something different than the phrase usually meant. The decision had been made to manage what was coming, not to reckon with what had already happened. These were not the same thing. The narration held that distinction carefully. The way you hold something fragile you are not yet ready to put down. Bernard Calloway had done the right thing for the wrong reason, and somewhere in the machinery of justice, that difference would matter. Not tonight, not in the parking lot, where Wallace Grimes was speaking quietly to the people standing around him, naming what they were witnessing. Not in the lobby, where Dorian Nash and Simone Nash were walking toward the exit together in the fluorescent light. Renata Chisholm a half-step behind, the leather attaché in her hand, now containing the first pages of a complaint that named 4 people and 1 institution, and would, when filed, open a door that Bernard Calloway's administrative leave decision could not close. Outside, the phone stayed up. The light stayed on. The record was already made, and it belonged now to everyone who had watched 2 minutes and 14 seconds of a parking lot in flat noon sun, which meant it belonged to everyone, which meant that Dorian Nash was no longer a man alone inside a building against an institution. He was a man walking out of a building into the light while 120 people held their own light up to meet him, and the story was no longer only his, which was both the loss and the gift of what the camera had seen. The morning of the press conference, Bernard Calloway stood in his bathroom at 6:14 a.m., rehearsing sentences in the mirror above his sink, and every sentence he tried felt like a door with no room behind it. He had spent 72 hours constructing a version of events that could hold weight under public scrutiny. The first version lasted 6 hours before Raymond Foster's preliminary report landed on his desk. The second version lasted until Tara Kim published the background interview at 11:00 p.m., the one where Raymond Foster, without using his name, confirmed that Reed Holloway had accumulated 3 prior complaints of excessive force in 4 years of service, and that all 3 had been reviewed internally, and that all 3 had been dismissed. The article ran with a single pull quote. The complaints were there. The record was there. The department chose not to see it. Nobody needed to identify the source. By midnight, every major outlet had the story, and Bernard Calloway's prepared remarks, 3 carefully structured paragraphs about a thorough review and swift action, were already functionally useless. What he was left with, standing at that mirror, was not a press strategy. It was a reckoning, And the difference between those two things was something Bernard Calloway had been successfully avoiding for most of his career. Meridian City Hall's press briefing room filled up 90 minutes before the scheduled start. Overhead, two large rectangular skylights flooded the space with the kind of flat, honest morning light that gives nowhere to hide, and overhead fluorescent panels along the ceiling's perimeter doubled the illumination until the room felt surgical, every face visible, every shadow canceled. Camera crews from 11 outlets had staked their positions by 8:30 a.m. Local journalists, national correspondents, 3 photographers who had been camped outside the 3rd Precinct for 2 days straight. Wallace Grimes arrived with 6 members of the newly formed civilian coalition and sat in the 3rd row in a dark burgundy blazer and black trousers, his hands folded in his lap, his expression the patient kind that carries decades of practice behind it. Renata Chisholm arrived at 9:05 a.m. and took her position to the left of the podium. She wore a black blazer over a white button-down shirt and charcoal trousers, and she carried a leather attaché that she set on the floor beside her left foot and did not open. She had a legal folder in her left hand, pale blue, thin, 5 pages inside. She had read those 5 pages enough times in the past 3 days that she could have delivered them from memory, but that was not the point. The folder was a physical object. It would be seen on camera. It would be understood. People in the room kept looking toward the side entrance. A whisper had circulated since the night before that Dorian Nash would attend, that he would stand at the podium himself, that he would address the press directly. Those people did not yet understand the kind of man they were dealing with. Dorian Nash was not present. That was not an accident. It was not a concession. It was the most deliberate thing he had done since the parking lot, and the people who understood power recognized it immediately for what it was. You do not stand in rooms that were not designed to honor you and ask them to honor you. You send your words, and you make them carry your full weight, and you let the room deal with the absence of your body while your meaning stands in the center of the floor. Bernard Calloway walked to the podium at 9:17 a.m. He was wearing his dress uniform, long sleeves, brass buttons, every commendation in its proper place, and it struck several reporters in the room simultaneously that a man in a decorated uniform was about to explain why his officers had dragged a decorated soldier across hot asphalt. Bernard Calloway placed both hands on the sides of the podium and looked at the room. He did not look comfortable. That, at least, was honest. He began with the department's acknowledgement. The language was passive, institutional, the kind of sentence structure that spreads responsibility into the air until no single person can be located within it. Errors in judgment were made. Protocols were not followed. The department recognizes. He read it from the paper prepared by the city's legal team, and his voice was steady, and it was the steadiness of a man who had accepted a script because writing his own would have required a confession he was not prepared to make in public. Those sitting close enough could see that he had not looked up from the paper once in the first 90 seconds. Then came the part the room had been waiting for. Reed Holloway and Craig Dunmore had been terminated from the Meridian City Police Department, effective immediately, pending the outcome of a federal civil rights investigation. The department would submit to mandatory federal oversight. An independent external review of all use of force complaints filed in the past 5 years would begin within 30 days. A restructured internal accountability system, developed with input from a federally appointed oversight board, would be implemented before the end of the fiscal year. Bernard Calloway read each line with the same flat cadence, and when he finished he folded the paper once and placed it inside his jacket pocket, and for a brief moment he looked at the room without speaking. The press corps was already moving, pens, keyboards, recording indicators blinking red. Wallace Grimes did not move at all, watching Bernard Calloway's face with the careful attention of a man taking inventory. What the cameras captured in that moment, and what several journalists would later write about in their post-conference analysis pieces, was the expression of a man who had arrived at a conclusion he did not choose. This was not contrition. It was something flatter and more complicated. The face of a person who had constructed a professional identity on the belief that his department was fundamentally sound, who had mentored officers and defended procedures and dismissed complaints, and moved steadily upward through the ranks of an institution he believed in, and who was now required to stand in a room full of cameras and confirm, in bureaucratic language chosen by lawyers, that the institution had been wrong in ways he had actively participated in sustaining. Whether Bernard Calloway would ever fully reckon with that privately, that question would remain unanswered for a long time. He stepped back from the podium. Renata Chisholm picked up the legal folder, approached the podium, and adjusted the microphone with the unhurried precision of someone who had stood in rooms like this many times. She set the folder on the podium's surface and opened it, and the camera from the central broadcast pool caught the neat block handwriting on the first page. Not typed, handwritten. Before she turned the folder toward herself, she said, "Command Sergeant Major Dorian Nash asked me to read the following statement on his behalf." She said it once, clearly, and then she looked down at the page and began. The statement was 6 sentences. She read them at the pace of someone who understood that language has weight, and that weight requires time. The first sentence established his service without ornamentation. 4 deployments, 17 years, the specific ribbon designations he had earned, the rank he held. He did not list these things with pride. The narration understood. He listed them as context. He listed them because the room needed to understand the full accounting of what had been dismissed in a grocery store parking lot. The second sentence named what had happened without adjectives. He had pulled over in a public parking lot, exhausted after a 61-day classified deployment, and fallen asleep in his own vehicle. 2 officers had approached, drawn a weapon before asking a single question, destroyed his personal property, and placed him face down on the pavement in zip ties in front of witnesses. The third sentence was the one that made 3 reporters in the back of the room stop typing simultaneously. It said, "I have been trained to identify and respond to threats in environments where the cost of misjudgment is measured in lives, and I am telling you that there was no threat in that parking lot on Tuesday afternoon, except the one that arrived with a badge and a gun and a presumption it carried from somewhere. I did not put it." The fourth sentence was quieter and in some ways more devastating for its quiet. It said, "I am not here today because I want an apology." An apology from an institution addresses an incident. What happened to me on Tuesday is not an incident. It is a documented pattern with a long history and a consistent target. And I am one of the people who has spent his life defending the country that contains that pattern. The fifth sentence announced the federal civil rights lawsuit. Brief, factual. The names of the defendants listed in the same order they appeared on the legal filing. Reed Holloway, Craig Dunmore, Bernard Calloway, and the city of Meridian. Renata Chisholm read Bernard Calloway's name in the same register as the others. She did not pause before it or after it. She did not need to. The sixth sentence was the last one. Renata Chisholm read it the way the statement had been written. Spare, direct, without rising inflection at the end, so that it landed not as rhetoric but as record. I did not survive 4 combat deployments, so that a parking lot in my own city could be the place where my country decided I was not worth the benefit of the doubt. Renata Chisholm closed the folder. The room was quiet, not the performed quiet of an audience waiting for a cue, but the involuntary kind. The kind that happens when language touches something true at sufficient depth that the human instinct for noise simply stops. 4 full seconds of it, the fluorescent light overhead and the skylight daylight between them, held the room in a clarity that felt almost accusatory. Every face visible, no softening, no shadow. Wallace Grimes pressed his folded hands together once, slowly, looking at the podium. A woman in the second row, a print journalist from the National Bureau, a woman who had covered 3 police reform hearings in the past 2 years and had developed a professional distance she relied on, looked down at her notebook and was still for a moment before she wrote anything. Then the questions began. They came fast and they came hard, and Renata Chisholm handled them with the specific economy of a former JAG attorney who has spent 2 decades in rooms where words have legal weight. She answered what she chose to answer and declined what she chose to decline, and every declination was stated so cleanly that pursuing it would have reflected poorly on the questioner. She confirmed the timeline of the federal civil rights filing. She confirmed the involvement of the Pentagon in the welfare check that preceded Dorian Nash's release. She confirmed that 3 prior excessive force complaints against Reed Holloway had been internally dismissed, and she said that the independent review the chief had announced this morning would determine whether the dismissal of those complaints constituted institutional negligence, and she said it in a tone that made clear she had already formed her own conclusion on that question. A reporter near the back asked where Dorian Nash was today. Renata Chisholm said, "He's resting. He spent 61 days overseas serving this country and then spent several hours in a holding cell. He has earned the right to rest." The room took that answer and what it contained, and some of the people in it wrote it down, and some of them looked toward the side door again, even though they knew by now he was not going to walk through it. And some of them understood finally that his absence was the statement that the 6 sentences Renata Chisholm had just read were the 6 sentences of a man who had already done enough, who had given enough, who was not going to stand in another room and perform his own injury for an audience, and who had instead put his words on a page in block handwriting and sent a woman with a legal folder to deliver them on his behalf while he was, somewhere in Meridian City, living the ordinary and hard-won hours of a Tuesday morning in his own country. Bernard Calloway stood to the right of the podium with his hands at his sides and said nothing further. Behind him, the dual skylights poured their flat and honest light across the floor of the room, and it illuminated everything: the cameras, the press, the legal folder on the podium, the empty space at the podium's center where a man had chosen, with full deliberation, not to stand. The coffee maker hissed and spat, and Dorian Nash stood in his kitchen in a white t-shirt and gray sweatpants, watching it like it was the most important thing in the world. Because right now it was. The smell of dark roast filling an apartment he had not slept in for 61 days. Natural light flooding through the large east-facing windows, falling in long, warm rectangles across the hardwood floor, catching the dust motes drifting in the still air. Plants on the sill, a pothos, a snake plant, a stubborn little succulent he had owned for 3 years and never once watered correctly. They had all survived without him. He supposed they always did. He was not thinking about the parking lot. He was choosing, actively and deliberately, to stand in this kitchen, in this light, and let the ordinary weight of a Tuesday morning hold him. The east wall held his military commendations in black frames, arranged not by rank or prestige, but by the order in which he had received them, a private chronology only he could read. Beside them, a single framed photograph, his grandmother Edna Nash, sitting on a porch somewhere in southern Georgia, wearing a floral blouse and white slacks, laughing at something outside the frame. The photograph was taken in 1987. Dorian Nash had not been born yet. He had always loved that, the idea that her joy existed before he did, that it had nothing to prove to him, that it was simply there, waiting. He poured his coffee and stood at the counter. On his kitchen table, beneath a folded newspaper, was an envelope from the Department of Defense. General Arthur Pennington's offer, a formal advisory role on a new DoD initiative focused on veteran reintegration. The letter was precise and respectful and written in the language of men who understood what Dorian Nash had paid to be in a position to advise anything. It was not charity. That was the word Dorian Nash kept returning to. Not charity. Recognition. Recognition that there was a specific and devastating gap between the country soldiers were trained to protect and the country they came home to, and that very few people could describe that gap from both sides simultaneously. Dorian Nash could. He had lived on both edges of it in the same afternoon. He had not yet answered the letter. He would. Just not today. Renata Chisholm had filed the federal civil rights lawsuit 4 days ago. It named Reed Holloway. It named Craig Dunmore. It named Chief Bernard Calloway. It named the city. The complaint was 47 pages long and written in the same surgical, unsparing language Renata Chisholm used for everything. Dorian Nash had read it once, signed where she told him to sign, and then placed it in a drawer. The law would do what the law would do. He had learned not to carry that weight in his body. There was other news he held more gently. Kezia Tamboli, 17 years old, standing in a parking lot with a phone she refused to put down, had received a scholarship offer from a journalism foundation. Full funding, 4 years, a school in the Northeast with a documentary program that had launched real careers. The foundation selection committee had made their decision independently through a formal application process. What they did not know, and what Dorian Nash would never publicize, was that he had made a single phone call to a man he knew from his second deployment, who now sat on that foundation's advisory board. Not a favor, not a transaction, just a word placed quietly into an ear that was already inclined to listen. Kezia Tamboli had done the rest herself. Wallace Grimes's witnessing community had filed its formal coalition paperwork. First city council hearing in 2 weeks, 40 members, then 80. And now over 100 people who had decided that standing in parking lot light and refusing to look away was a form of civic architecture. Dorian Nash respected that enormously. A knock at the door. 3 even knocks. Simone's knock, the same since childhood. She came in, carrying 2 containers of food from the Haitian restaurant 6 blocks over, wearing a green zip-up hoodie and dark jogger pants. Her natural hair pulled back. She set the containers on the counter, looked at her brother standing in his white t-shirt and gray sweatpants with his coffee, and said, "You look like a person." He said, "That's new." She laughed. A real laugh. Unguarded. And it moved through the apartment like light moves through water. They sat at the kitchen table, and they did not talk about the case. They did not talk about press conferences or lawsuits or administrative leave or national news cycles. They talked about their grandmother. They talked about the way Edna Nash used to keep a radio playing in every room of her house, always tuned to something, gospel in the morning, jazz by afternoon, and by evening something that wasn't quite either. Simone said she had been thinking about that lately, the way their grandmother filled rooms with sound like it was a form of company. They talked about the trip they had always meant to take together, Ghana maybe, or Senegal, somewhere that felt like a beginning rather than an explanation. Simone said she had enough leave saved. Dorian Nash said he might have some time, depending on what he decided about the letter. Simone looked at him and did not push. She understood the way he needed to approach certain doors. Slowly, from the side, never straight on. They ate in the good light. Later, after Simone had gone and the containers were stacked neatly by the sink, Dorian Nash stood at his east-facing window with his second cup of coffee. Late morning now. The street below moved the way streets do. Ordinary people. A delivery driver double-parked. A woman with a stroller navigating the curb. 2 men talking outside a barber shop. A kid on a bike. A Tuesday. The kind of Tuesday that exists in 10,000 cities simultaneously. Unremarkable and irreplaceable. He had fought for this. All of it. Every ordinary second of it. He did not know if he would fully heal from what the parking lot had cost him. He did not know if Reed Holloway would spend the rest of his life in the same blind certainty that had put him there. He did not know if the next man who looked like Dorian Nash, exhausted and quiet in a parking lot somewhere, would be treated differently. He did not know, and he had stopped pretending that any of the paperwork or the headlines or the 4 seconds of silence in a press conference room resolved that question. What he knew was this: he was standing in his own home, in his grandmother's light, carrying both what had been done to him and what he had refused to let it make him. That was not a victory. It was something harder and more permanent than victory. It was who he was. He sipped his coffee. Below, the street continued. He watched it for a long time. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.